Part 1: The Ghost in the F-150. The rain came in silver ribbons off the Pacific, heavy, cold, and relentless. Jordan Glass barely noticed. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in a tired, rhythmic squeak against the glass, an old, fraying habit neither the truck nor Jordan had the heart to break. He was driving his old 1978 F-150, its faded blue paint scarred by years of logging roads and coastal salt, hugging the winding, treacherous curves of Highway 101 along the Oregon coast. To his right, sheer cliffs dropped into a violent, black maw of water that churned and foamed against the jagged rocks below. To his left, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars climbed into the low-hanging fog, their trunks wrapped in moss like ancient sentinels guarding a graveyard. Beside him sat Delinda, alive. Her auburn hair, the exact shade of burnished copper when the sun hit it just right, was damp from the ocean mist slipping through the cracked passenger window. She had tucked her bare feet beneath her on the seat, the way she always did on long drives, exuding a warmth that felt entirely real. One hand rested lazily on his forearm, fingers tracing idle, gentle circles over the flannel of his sleeve. Soft music, some old folk album they both loved, hummed through the truck's dashboard speakers, blending with the steady rumble of tires on wet asphalt. Jordan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. He knew this road by heart. He knew this truck, the faint smell of oil and pine needles baked into the vinyl seats. He knew the amber glow of the dashboard lights, but more than anything he knew the devastating truth: this was a ghost. The memory was perfect, but it was a cage. He was replaying the last good day before his entire world went dark. Every detail was a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from him. Delinda looked over at him and smiled that crooked little half grin, one dimple deeper than the other. "You're doing it again," she said softly, her voice warm as cedar smoke. "Doing what?" "Thinking too hard. I can hear the gears grinding from here." Jordan swallowed hard, a lump of pure ache forming in his throat. Her voice hurt, not because it was wrong, but because it was flawless. The slight Oregon lilt, the gentle teasing. It was the sound of a life he could never have back. "I miss you," he whispered, the confession tearing out of him like an open wound. "God, Delinda, it hurts so bad." Delinda's expression softened, changing from playful teasing to a profound, fragile recognition. It was as if she understood that she was just a projection of a broken man's mind, a beautiful mirage hovering over a black abyss of sorrow. "I know," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I know, Jordan." The truck rounded a familiar bend overlooking the crashing coastline, where waves exploded against the rocks in white fury. Then, the illusion fractured. The dashboard lights flickered and died. The radio warped into a horrific screech of static and distant, weeping voices. Delinda's hand tightened on his arm, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "Jordan," she cried out, but her voice was overlapping, splitting into multiple registers. The ocean vanished. Darkness swallowed the road, and the old Ford pickup dissolved around them like smoke. And just before the dream collapsed entirely into a void of pure grief, 4 distinct women's voices screamed his name in unison, screams of absolute, agonizing loss. Part 2: The Fracture. Jordan awoke violently on the porch of the farmhouse, gasping for air as if he had just been pulled from the surf. Cold mountain air slammed into his lungs, and the relentless roar of rain hammering the metal roof overhead filled his ears. The Cascade Mountains stretched out into the blackness around the isolated property, enormous and silent beneath boiling storm clouds. He was sitting in the old wooden rocking chair Delinda's grandfather had built, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and bitter neglect. The dream lingered like a jagged knife twisted in his chest. 2 years. It had been 2 agonizing years since the logging accident took her. 2 years since that phone call shattered his reality. 2 years since he stood in the freezing rain, watching a coffin disappear into the Oregon earth while his entire world went grey and silent. He had come to this isolated family farmhouse intending to stay a week to clear his head. He never left. He merely existed, repairing engines for locals, taking remote programming contracts, doing just enough custom woodworking to survive, but entirely refusing to live. He was a ghost inhabiting a house of memories. The porch light flickered once, twice. Jordan looked up slowly, wiping the cold sweat and rain from his face. The air in front of the farmhouse twisted, shimmering like heat distortion rising off a summer pavement. Then, reality itself tore open with a sound like tearing silk, amplified by thunder. 4 vertical fractures sliced through the night across the yard, glowing wounds suspended in the pouring rain, their edges crackling with an impossible, violent violet light. Jordan stumbled to his feet, the wool blanket falling away into the dirt. The openings widened violently, and 4 women fell through them, tumbling onto the wet grass as if shoved by unseen hands. The tears in space snapped shut instantly, leaving only the sound of the downpour and the frantic pounding of his heart. Jordan stared, unable to breathe. All 4 women looked exactly like Delinda, not similar, not sisters or look-alikes. It was her face, her hazel eyes with the distinct gold flecks, her auburn hair now soaked and plastered to their foreheads, her build, her posture, and the tiny, unmistakable scar on the left eyebrow from a childhood fall. Yet they were completely different in their wreckage. One was dressed in blue medical scrubs, a stethoscope still hanging around her neck. One wore a tailored business coat and blouse, now soaked and caked in mud. One was in layered outdoor hiking gear, her backpack straps tangled across her chest. One wore grease-stained mechanic overalls, her heavy boots caked in earth from another world. All 4 looked entirely disoriented, terrified, shivering in the sudden mountain downpour. Then their eyes adjusted to the dark porch. They saw him. Every single one of them froze. The woman in the scrubs began crying first, her trembling hands flying to her mouth. No, it can't be. The mechanic dropped heavily to her knees in the mud, staring up in utter shock. The businesswoman covered her mouth, her eyes wide and overflowing with tears. The hiker whispered his name like a desperate prayer whispered into the dark. Jordan. Jordan backed away until his shoulders collided with the heavy timber of the porch post. He was convinced grief had finally broken his mind. Yet, grief recognized grief instantly. Each of these women wasn't looking at a stranger with curiosity. They were looking at him with the exact same devastated, longing, fiercely protective expression his Delinda had always possessed. The medic stepped forward first, rain streaming down her face. You died, she whispered, her voice trembling. 3 years ago in my world, a car accident on the pass, I couldn't save you. The mechanic looked up through a veil of tears. Mine too, a hunting accident. You were gone before the medics could even get up the mountain. The businesswoman nodded shakily. I watched them pull your body out of the wreckage. Hiking, the last one said quietly, her voice cracking. You fell protecting me from a bear, I survived, you didn't. Jordan's legs completely gave out, and he sank heavily onto the wooden porch steps. Each version of Delinda had lost a version of him, and somehow, through the unfathomable, crushing weight of their shared grief echoing across 5 separate realities, the fabric of existence had finally ruptured under the strain. Rain poured down, but nobody moved. Lightning flashed, illuminating 5 souls trapped in the same beautiful, tragic ghost story. Finally, Jordan whispered the only truth left to him. You're all real. The mechanic, grease still embedded in the lines of her hands, laughed weakly through a sob. So are you, Jordan, so are you. Part 3, the early days of alignment. The first weeks were an overwhelming tempest of emotion. The farmhouse, which had been a silent tomb for 2 years, suddenly overflowed with voices that were all variations of the exact same voice. They all moved the same way, tucked their hair behind their ears identically, and made the same soft humming sound when deep in thought. Yet Jordan learned their unique distinctions carefully, like handling fragile glass. There was Lynn, Delinda 1, the trauma nurse who was calm under pressure and fiercely gentle with pain. She had the steadiest hands he had ever seen. A consequence of throwing herself into saving strangers when she couldn't save her own Jordan. Delinda 2, the financial consultant with a mind like a steel trap and terrifying organizational skills, who had watched her brilliant corporate spreadsheets turn to ash when her world emptied. Delinda 3, the quiet, deeply intuitive wildlife photographer who had tried to outrun her sorrow by disappearing into the deep backcountry with a camera. And Delinda 4, the blunt, warm diesel mechanic who could rebuild an engine, blindfolded, and possessed a booming, resonant laugh that could shatter the heaviest silences. They finished each other's thoughts. They knew when one was about to cry before the tears even formed. What should have been deeply disturbing instead became the deepest, most profound comfort Jordan had ever known. None felt replaced, none viewed the others as competition. They had all lived the same love, suffered the same shattering loss, and found their anchor once again. But alignment didn't happen overnight. There were nights when Jordan would wake up screaming from a nightmare, only to find all 4 of them standing at his bedside, drawn by a phantom tether of shared panic. There were evenings by the fire when the sheer impossibility of their existence threatened to collapse them under psychological weight. One night, Dee sat cross-legged on the hearth, the firelight catching the old grease stains on her skin. "We all know what that black, suffocating loneliness felt like after losing you," she said, her voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Why the hell would any of us want the others to feel that ever again?" Jordan looked around at them. 4 versions of the same woman, different lives, same heart. Lynn smiled, her eyes reflecting the embers. "You don't divide love, Jordan," Della nodded smoothly. "You multiply it." Part 4, the genesis of the glass estate. Months turned into seasons, and the isolated farm became a crucible of raw, relentless human efficiency. They didn't just survive, they built an empire out of necessity and brilliant minds. Dee took over the rusted old barn, transforming it into a state-of-the-art machine and fabrication shop. The screech of angle grinders, the blinding arc of welding torches, and the deep, throbbing idle of diesel engines became the farmhouse's new symphony. She could fix anything with a piston, and soon local loggers and farmers were bypassing town entirely to bring their broken, heavy machinery to the miracle worker on the mountain. Della organized the chaos. She pulled Jordan's unorganized coding contracts out of the dark, renegotiated his rates, and structured their collective talents into high-yield digital platforms. She launched an online marketplace for Jordan's custom woodworking patterns and engineered a massive subscriber network for Dee's mechanical repair tutorials. Under her financial architecture, money ceased to be a worry. It became an abundant resource. Lynn quietly converted a large, drafty outbuilding into a clean, warm emergency medical clinic. The mountain communities were hours away from a real hospital. Lynn filled that void. She treated chainsaw gashes, delivered local Barbies, and managed chronic illnesses for agging mountain folk who had been left behind by modern infrastructure. Indy documented everything. Her wildlife photography collections sold to international journals for staggering sums, funding their private land expansion. She used the capital to initiate a massive habitat restoration project across the valley, planting thousands of native seedlings and protecting the watershed. Jordan was the spine that held it together. He didn't build sci-fi gadgets, he built practical, elite solutions. He engineered an incredibly efficient, low-impact hydroelectric system using mountain runoff, powering the entire property for free. He built automated agricultural greenhouse systems using salvaged parts, providing fresh food through freezing winters. He understood how things connected, how problems fit together like puzzle pieces no one else saw. The community stopped asking questions. When the Glass family repaired washed-out county roads before the state could even dispatch a truck, or delivered cords of seasoned firewood to freezing households during record blizzards, the locals simply accepted them. The mountain kept its secrets. Then came the children. All 4 pregnancies began within days of one another. The medical impossibility of it would later draw firestorms, but inside the house, it felt like reality correcting a profound error. The women went through everything as an unbreakable collective. When a catastrophic blizzard buried the pass, labor hit them simultaneously. It was a masterclass in elite synchronization. Lynn barking orders between her own contractions, Dee prepping sterile instruments, Della timing intervals on a spreadsheet, and Indy holding Jordan's shaking hands. 2 boys, 2 girls, born within minutes of one another. Rowan, Ash, Sage, and Willow grew up secure, loved by an unbreakable shield of 4 identical mothers and 1 devoted father. The children never knew confusion. To them, the multi-layered warmth of their home was as natural as the gravity that held them to the earth. Part 5, the legal gauntlet. The outside world finally arrived 6 days before the children's 5th birthday. 3 black, unmarked SUVs crawled up the winding mountain road at dawn, their tires crunching menacingly on the gravel. Jordan saw them from the porch, a cold dread seizing his chest as the outside world finally caught up to their impossible sanctuary. Inside, the children were helping decorate the dining room with crooked paper streamers, arguing passionately about cake frosting colors. Federal agents stepped out, FBI, Homeland Security, and forensic auditors. Leading the charge was Agent Malcolm Reeves, a man with hollowed eyes and a posture weighed down by decades of chasing the worst corners of humanity. "Jordan Glass," Reeves called out, flashing his credentials. "We have some questions regarding federal tax anomalies, identity duplication, and unregistered medical and commercial operations on this property." What followed was a grueling, months-long nightmare of systemic scrutiny. The government suspected a laundry list of dark, high-tech crimes: illegal human cloning, massive identity fraud, human experimentation, cult behavior, and international document forgery. But as the investigation ground on, the bureaucratic machinery began to stall against undeniable reality. The genetic testing results came back from the federal labs, leaving the agency's forensic specialists utterly paralyzed. All 4 women were genetically identical down to the absolute last molecular marker. Their aging was identical. Their fingerprints were a perfect, impossible match. Even the childhood scars on their left eyebrows matched down to the millimeter. "It's biologically impossible," the lead medical investigator muttered during a closed-door deposition in the farmhouse dining room. "Even identical twins have different fingerprints. It's as if the same woman was pulled out of time 4 separate times." The children only complicated the forensic web. DNA confirmed they were all biologically Jordans. Furthermore, because the 4 women shared an identical genetic profile, maternity tests showed full maternal compatibility across all 4 children. Biologically, every child belonged to every mother. Then came the heaviest legal hammer: bigamy. "Mr. Glass," Agent Reeves said, slamming a thick folder onto the heavy oak dining table. "Even if we look past the scientific impossibility of your household, the United States tax code, the state of Oregon, and federal law are entirely clear. Bigamy is a felony. You are cohabiting with and claiming domestic partnerships with 4 separate women. By all accounts, you are operating an illegal polygamous marriage." Jordan didn't flinch. He looked Reeves dead in the eye, his voice calm, steady, and devoid of fear. "To have a case for bigamy or polygamy, Agent, you have to prove fraud, coercion, or the existence of multiple legal marriage certificates designed to exploit the system. Go check the county records. There is only 1 marriage certificate on file in this county. It bears my name, and it bears the name of Delinda Glass." Della stepped forward, placing a perfectly organized stack of legal binders on the table. "As the financial and legal administrator for this estate, let me clarify our legal standing," she said with surgical, terrifying precision. "Lynn, Indy D, and myself do not possess competing marriage certificates. Legally, we operate as a single, centralized domestic LLC. The property, the businesses, and the assets are held jointly under a corporate trust." She leaned in, her hazel eyes locking onto Reeves. "Furthermore, under the strict letter of the law, you cannot charge a man with marrying multiple women when federal DNA, forensic fingerprinting, and state dental records prove that all 4 of us are, in fact, the exact same legal entity. If you claim I am a different woman to prosecute him for bigamy, your own DNA evidence refutes you. If you claim we are the same woman, then he has only ever been married to his wife. You cannot have it both ways to suit an indictment." Reeves stared at the binders, a headache pulsing behind his eyes. The legal paradox was ironclad. To prosecute Jordan for bigamy, the government would have to legally define what these women were, and doing so would force them to admit to the public that alternate realities or cloning existed, opening a catastrophic Pandora's box the higher-ups desperately wanted to avoid. In the final, exhausted confrontation in the dining room, the sun was setting over the snow-covered Cascades. The rest of the agents had retreated to their vehicles, thoroughly defeated by the legal and biological brick wall. Agent Reeves sat alone across from Jordan, staring out the window at the yard. Outside, the 4 Delindas were laughing, helping the 4 children build a massive snow fort. "You understand your family should not exist," Reeves said quietly, his voice stripped of its bureaucratic armor. "We know," Jordan replied, his voice soft, filled with a deep, unshakable peace. Reeves watched little Rowan thoughtfully helping Sage lift a heavy block of snow, while Willow fearlessly climbed to the top of the structure, cheered on by Dee and Lynn. "The psychologists we brought in, they expected a cult. They expected severe childhood trauma, isolation, or psychological abuse," Reeves murmured, shaking his head. "Instead, they told me it's one of the healthiest, most emotionally articulate family environments they've ever evaluated. One of your daughters asked the psychologist a question during the interview. She asked, 'How can having more people love you be abuse?' The doctor didn't have an answer." Reeves stood up, closing his briefcase. He looked at Jordan, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his tired mouth. "I've spent 23 years investigating the absolute worst things humans can do to one another. Your family is the first impossible thing I've ever run across that didn't make me lose faith." He extended his hand. "Unofficially, Mr. Glass, stay on this mountain. Live your life. Officially, a lot of forensic data is about to suffer a catastrophic server corruption. The federal government is going to forget you exist. Part 6: The Deepening Horizon. The years that followed the departure of the federal SUVs were marked by an even deeper consolidation of their unique life. The world outside the mountain continued its chaotic, noisy spin, but within the boundaries of the glass property, life deepened into something magnificent. As the children grew from toddlers into brilliant, observant adolescents, the physical and emotional architecture of the house expanded to meet them. Jordan, utilizing the abundant capital Della continued to generate from their online networks, broke ground on a massive, timber-framed expansion of the main house. He worked alongside Dee in the crisp autumn air, framing out massive skylights that looked out toward the rugged peaks of the Cascades. They didn't hire a crew. They didn't need one. Jordan's relentless precision paired with Dee's mastery of heavy machinery meant the two of them raised massive, 6-ton Douglas fir beams with the smooth coordination of a 20-man construction team. The children became extensions of this collective efficiency. Rowan, Lynn's son, developed his mother's incredibly steady hands and an innate curiosity about biological systems. By age 10, he was sitting in Lynn's clinic, carefully prepping sutures and learning how to read complex diagnostic monitors. Ash, Della's daughter, inherited her mother's terrifyingly sharp intelligence and organizational focus. She ran the farm's internal inventory systems by age 12, tracking their energy output, agricultural yields, and corporate trust accounts with a tablet and a razor-sharp mind. Sage, Indy's boy, practically lived in the old-growth forests surrounding the property. He could identify every bird call within a 10-mile radius and possessed a quiet, intuitive empathy that made animals trust him instinctively. Willow, Dee's girl, was a regular fixture in the machine shop, covered in grease before breakfast, redesigning fuel injection systems for their fleet of recovery vehicles. There was no identity crisis among the siblings. They knew exactly who gave birth to them, but they also knew they possessed a protective matronage that defied the standard laws of human biology. If Rowan was sick, Lynn provided medical care. Della managed the schedule, Indy sat by his bed telling stories of the high backcountry, and Dee made comfort food that filled the house with the scent of roasted garlic and rosemary. Yet, as the children approached their teenage years, Jordan began to notice a shift in the women. It was subtle at first, a lingering gaze toward the violet valley depths where the tears in space had once formed, a shared silence that fell over the dinner table when the wind howled through the Douglas firs. The trauma of their initial arrivals had long since healed, but the cosmic bill had yet to be fully paid. The universe, Jordan realized with a creeping sense of dread, rarely leaves an open paradox unmonitored forever. Part 7: The Echo Chamber. It happened on a night when the moon was swallowed by a massive, high-altitude electrical storm. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that the glass windows of the newly expanded living room began to hum a low, vibrating note. Jordan was in his workshop, polishing a custom walnut dining table, when the power grid he had engineered suddenly inverted. The lights didn't go out. They flared into a brilliant, blinding violet hue, identical to the light of the fractures that had brought the Delindas to him 5 years prior. He dropped his tools, his heart leaping into his throat, and ran toward the main house. When he burst through the double doors, he found the kitchen completely still. The children were frozen in place around the hearth, their faces pale. In the center of the room stood Lynn, Della, Indy, and Dee. They weren't looking at the children, and they weren't looking at Jordan. They were holding hands in a perfect circle, their eyes wide, staring into the center of the kitchen where the air was beginning to tear open once more. This time it wasn't 4 separate fractures. It was a single, massive, rotating vortex of violet energy that smelled of ozone, coastal salt, and old cedar smoke. Jordan, Lynn called out, her voice layered with the distinct, uncanny echo of her counterparts. It's pulling at us, not physically. Inside, the realities are trying to snap back. Della's face was taut with calculation, though tears were leaking down her cheeks. The mathematical probability of maintaining a localized multi-universal paradox over 7 years without a systemic collapse. We've reached the threshold, Jordan. The universe is balancing the ledger. Jordan stepped forward, his boots slamming against the hardwood floors he had laid with his own hands. He reached out, trying to grab Dee's arm, but his hand passed right through her sleeve as if she were made of cold light. She looked down at her hands, which were beginning to pixelate into shimmering ribbons of silver water. No, Jordan roared. a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance that shook the timber beams overhead. I already stood in the rain and watched a coffin go into the dirt. I already spent 2 years dying in a chair on that porch. I didn't build this family just to watch the sky tear it away from me. Dad, Willow screamed, moving to rush toward her mother's, but Rowan and Ash caught her, pulling her back into the safety of the brick hearth. The vortex expanded, its roar growing until it drowned out the sound of the thunder outside. The 4 women began to lift slightly off the ground, their forms blurring, blending into one another. For a horrifying second, Jordan didn't see 4 distinct Delindas. He saw a shifting, kaleidoscopic mirage of a single woman, her hair flashing from grease-stained braids to tailored business cuts to damp copper curls. The universe wasn't trying to kill them. It was trying to merge them back into a single timeline, a correction that would erase the 5 years of exquisite life they had built on this mountain. If they merged, which reality would win? Which children would cease to exist? Jordan didn't hesitate. He didn't have a degree in quantum mechanics, and he didn't have an understanding of multi-dimensional physics. But he understood systems. He understood how things connected, how problems fit together, and how an elite, high-skill cook handles a kitchen that is burning down around him. He turned toward his automated control panel on the wall, the central nerve center of his custom hydroelectric and solar grid. Ash, Jordan shouted over the roar of the cosmic tear. What's the maximum load capacity on the inversion capacitors in the barn? Ash didn't panic. Her sharp intelligence clamped down on her fear instantly. The lithium-ion arrays can hold 1200 amps before thermal runaway, Dad, but if you bridge the main breaker, you'll feed the entire mountain's kinetic runoff back into the house. Exactly, Jordan yelled back, his hands moving over the switches with lightning speed. Dee built those backup generators out of heavy-duty locomotive alternators. They don't just generate electricity, they create a localized electromagnetic field that grounds everything within a half-mile radius. He looked back at the vortex. The women were fadding, their voices becoming a distant, unified whisper of his name. You told me you multiply love, Jordan cried out, his hand wrapping around the massive, custom-built copper throw switch that controlled the entire property's power. Well, I'm about to multiply the current. Hold on to each other. With a single, violent motion, Jordan slammed the copper switch down. Part 8, the final anchor. The result was an explosion of pure, terrestrial force. The heavy locomotive alternators in Dee's barn roared to life with a mechanical scream that shook the very foundation of the mountain. Thousands of amps of raw, engineered electricity, harnessed from the relentless mountain runoff Jordan had spent years tamming, flooded into the house's grounding rods. The localized electromagnetic field snapped shut around the farmhouse like an iron vice. The violet vortex didn't explode, it stalled. The spinning light caught on the sheer volume of raw, physical current grounding it to the Oregon earth. Jordan didn't wait for the systems to fail. He ran directly into the violet light, ignoring the searing pain of static electricity that arcs across his skin, and threw his arms around the shifting, blurred form of the women. He didn't try to pull them out. He used his own weight, his own physical reality to anchor them. You are not ghosts, Jordan screamed into the wind, his muscles tearing under the immense pressure of the cosmic drag. You built this clinic, you built these businesses, you gave birth to these children. This dirt knows your names, I know your names, Lynn, Della, Indy, Dee, stay with me. From the hearth, the 4 children broke free from their paralysis. They didn't run into the dangerous light, but they linked hands, forming an unbroken chain of living heritage, their voices joining their father's in a unified shout that echoed through the roaring house. For 3 agonizing seconds, the universe fought a man, 4 mothers, 4 children, and a massive, roaring locomotive generator. Then, with a sound like a heavy metal door slamming shut deep underground, the vortex broke. The violet light imploded into a single, microscopic pinprick before vanishing completely. The house was instantly plunged into deep, silent darkness, save for the soft, ticking cool-down of the electrical panels and the steady, heavy sound of 9 people breathing in the dark. Jordan fell hard to the floor, his chest heaving, his hands scraped and bleeding from the static discharge. A flashlight clicked on, then another. Jordan looked up through his blurred vision. Tumbled on the floor around him, groaning but completely solid, were 4 distinct women. Lynn was checking her own pulse, her nurse's instinct instantly kicking in. Della was already smoothing down her shirt, her eyes darting to the control panel to assess the structural damage. Indy was laughing quietly, a breathless, wild sound, while Dee was flat on her back, staring at the ceiling beams, her knuckles covered in grease and her face split into a massive, triumphant grin. The children threw themselves into the pile, a chaotic mass of limbs, tears, and joyous shouts. Jordan crawled forward, wrapping his massive arms around the entire impossible collective. The ledger was balanced. They hadn't defeated the universe. They had simply proven to it that their roots on this mountain were too deep, too heavy, and too beautifully engineered to be pulled out of the soil. Part 9: The Triumph of the Glass Estate. 3 years later, the mountain road was quiet once more, but the farmhouse had evolved into something that resembled a thriving, self-contained village of elite capability. The story of the Glass family had become a legend among the scattered coastal and mountain communities. No one spoke of cloning or alternate realities anymore. They spoke of the Glass Estate, a place where the impossible was done daily, with a quiet, modest efficiency that commanded absolute respect across the state of Oregon. It was the evening of Rowan, Ash, Sage, and Willow's 8th birthday. The expanded dining room was ablaze with the warm, comforting light of custom-designed LED chandeliers, powered by a now completely stabilized, uninvertible hydroelectric grid. The massive walnut table Jordan had finished years ago was loaded with an incredible feast. Jordan, utilizing his decades of professional, high-volume kitchen mastery, had prepared the entire meal himself. He moved between the commercial-grade stove and the long table with smooth, elegant placement, carving perfectly roasted meats, plating vibrant vegetables grown in his automated greenhouses, and setting down fresh bread that filled the high-ceilinged room with a rich, yeasty warmth. Sitting around the table were his 4 wives, each radiant, their distinctions now celebrated openly without a single shred of lingering sorrow. Lynn had expanded her clinic into a formal county-recognized rural emergency outpost, training local volunteers and saving dozens of lives each winter. Della had recently finalized a corporate structure that placed the entire mountain valley under a conversational land trust, ensuring that no logging corporation could ever touch the ancient Douglas firs that had guarded their initial reunion. Indy's latest photography exhibition, titled The Multiverse of the Wild, had just won an international award, though the art world still believed the title was purely metaphorical. And Dee had just finished building a custom, clean-energy tractor prototype that local agricultural boards were hailing as the future of small-scale farming. The children, now 8 years old, sat at the center of the table, their faces glowing in the candlelight. They were secure, remarkably intelligent, and possessed an emotional maturity that drew praise from every outsider who ever met them. They had 4 mothers who loved them unconditionally, and a father who had literally stood against the collapse of space to keep them whole. Jordan walked to the head of the table, a bottle of fine Oregon wine in his hand. He poured a glass for each of his wives, his eyes lingering on each one, catching the distinct gold flecks in Lynn's hazel eyes, the sharp tilt of Della's chin, the quiet depth in Indy's expression, and the joyful crease near Dee's mouth. He stood for a moment, looking out the massive panoramic windows at the Cascade Mountains. Outside, a gentle, pristine snow was beginning to fall, drifting across the valley like a soft, silver blanket. 10 years ago he had stood in a freezing rain, a broken man watching a coffin disappear into the earth, his soul completely hollowed out by grief. He had believed with absolute certainty that his life was over, that he was merely waiting for his own body to catch up to his dead heart. He looked back at the table. The children were laughing, Ash bossing Rowan around about who got the largest piece of cake, Willow showing Dee a miniature gear template she had sketched on a napkin, and Sage quietly feeding a scrap of meat to the old rescue hound resting near Indy's feet. Jordan raised his glass, his voice thick with an emotion that was no longer pain, but something infinitely vast, heavy, and beautiful. "To the road we took," Jordan said softly. The 4 Delindas stood up in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized, their glasses catching the golden light of the room. "And to the love that multiplied," they responded together, their voices layering into that familiar, beautiful, uncanny symphony that no longer frightened him, but served as the bedrock of his entire existence. They drank, and as the laughter broke out once more over the cutting of the cake, Jordan stepped back onto the porch for just a brief moment to breathe in the crisp, cold mountain air. The snow fell silently around him, coating the sturdy timber posts and the solar arrays gleaming on the roof. The future was wide open, impossible by every known law of man and nature, but it was theirs. And as Jordan felt a warm, familiar hand slip into his sleeve to trace idle circles on his arm, he didn't look back into the dark. He simply smiled into the beautiful, triumphant night.